Excuse me. Thank you so much.
What do I do to get this Skype?
So, you could use, why don't we use the back?
Pussy.
This is a little thing down at the bottom, the S.
I'm on the back.
Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody to our event, and this is Ginger Stillman, and our event is called Where We Live, Domestic Violence and Children in Storage. We couldn't think of a better title for the children in storage. I understand there are two people on the line. Can you please introduce yourselves? One. Who is online?
This is Alicia Moore from the UNA-USA Detroit.
Very good, thank you, Alicia. Welcome.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Great, and you'll be able to listen in, and we'll have a second session around 4:15 that will wrap up our small group work. I'd like to welcome you all to this 5th annual Race, Criminal Justice, and Human Rights event that we've held here at the UN Foundation. And again, to thank the UN Foundation for providing this excellent space, which also allows us to connect with people from around the country. We have a really fine group of speakers here, and we'll introduce them a little bit later. And because each one of you has a great deal to contribute, we're going to ask you to introduce yourselves, as we'll go quickly around the room in a minute or two, and ask you to do that so that we know who's here, and so we can draw from you with your talent as we go forward. I want to thank the August State Planning Committee and the Board of Directors, and George Garland, who's here to my left wearing the UNA-USA t-shirt, who is president of the Southern New York State Division Board. And I'd like especially to thank Brian Kaminski, who is seated over there, and Troy Wolfe, who's seated over here in the middle, who are both contributing as speakers, but also have helped set everything up. Whenever any of us speaks, would you please use the microphone, turn it on so that it's red, and that will help us get this taped better. And we have two people doing some taping and photography. We've got Sylvia, who is an intern from Austria at EF International School, and David Stillman and Stedman Blake. And Stedman will do the small groups. He is a student at Mercy College. This afternoon we have two themes. One is the Domestic Violence Justice Act, which is a passionate piece of legislation for Ruth Hassell-Thompson, who I think is one of the ones who introduced it. And Ruth is one of our speakers today, and others in the room who are equally passionate about that issue. It is a New York State law or bill wending its way. She can explain. The other topic is children in storage. And we first got very interested and very involved when we saw not only the kids crossing the border, not only the kids being brutally taken away from their parents, but they were being shipped to New York State right in our backyard.
Yeah.
And we have a list of these places where there are government contracts and where some of these were taken. And that was rather shocking. One of them was a place where I had worked some years ago, Children's Village, and again, right in my backyard. It's a result of the practice of separating children from migrant families and families seeking asylum. And the United Nations Human Rights Office has called this separation illegal. And they have urged immediate halt to the practice, which has now halted. One of their spokespeople said that the practice amounts to arbitrary and unlawful interference in family life and is a serious violation of the rights of the child. We have articles on these subjects, and we can share this information with you. I'd like to introduce you to the United Nations Association. If you have not joined yet, I hope you will join. I hope you will become members and help us promote the work of the United Nations and help America be part of the UN at the citizen level. It is so important for all of us to be part of the United Nations, to know what it does, and to take interest and become involved. We do this, we interact with the UN and its programs and their implications for our country. In New York, we have chapters in the Mid-Hudson Valley, in Westchester, in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, and we're starting a new chapter in the Bronx, and we hope to start one soon in Nassau County. All of these come together under the Southern New York State Division, and I've introduced you to George, who is the president of the division. Today we're dealing with 3 areas that are going to be discussed in small groups, and you each have a sheet that is a small group discussion piece, and it also gives you some space on the back to jot down your notes. Sorry, 4 groups. One group having to do with the Domestic Violence Justice Act, and then 3 under the area of children in storage. Depending on how many people we have today, we may want to adjust that to 2 groups, but we'll see how that goes. One is on the asylum kids in New York State. Another one is on U.S. asylum policies and processes at the southern border. And then there's what we can do, and that includes not only what we can do as individuals and institutions, but also what we can do toward the UN. And Ryan and Troy will certainly be able to help you understand some of that. What I'd like to do is go around the room and have each of you introduce yourselves very quickly, a name and where you're from, but come up to a microphone, please, so that everybody can hear. Well, can we start over here?
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
And just your name and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Jeanne Betsock. I'm the Vocational Education Specialist at the Urban Center for Change, part of the Urban Resource Institute. Thank you.
Thank you.
George Carlin, I'm president of the Southern New York State Division Board, and I live in Austin.
Good afternoon, my name is Virginia Nepper, and I work with the Fortune Society, which works with individuals that have histories of criminal justice involvement.
Good afternoon, my name is Catherine LaPuente. I'm Program Coordinator for Health Right International's Human Rights Clinic.
Good afternoon. I'm Elaine Congress. I'm Professor and Associate Dean at Fordham University Graduate School of Social Service. I also represent an NGO, the International Federation of Social Workers at the UN.
Hello, my name is Peter DiBartolo. I'm a member of the Southern New York State Division Board, UNA-USA. I teach at Adelphi University and am also a member of the American Society of Criminology.
My name is Richard Horowitz. I'm an attorney and I deal with certain international and human rights issues.
Just press the button.
Oh, sure. My name is Carol Sonnenberg, and I formed a nonprofit called Create for Social Justice, and I hold events in my apartment to cause awareness to it.
Hello, my name is Elena Maria Hernández Martinez, and I'm working at the United Nations and volunteering with the ICRC Restoring Family Links program.
Good afternoon. My name is Serena Lagori. I'm with New Hour for Women and Children. Hello, Senator. I've worked for many years on women and girls issues around criminal justice. I'm also formerly incarcerated and happy to be here from Long Island.
Hi, my name is Nadine Figger. I work for the New York City Department of Education, and I'm contributing to developing the Bronx chapter in the capacity of the president.
Hi, I'm Peg Shannon with the Southern New York State Division Vice President for Advocacy, and I live in Queens.
Hi everyone, I'm Ryan Kaminski, Senior Program Manager for Human Rights at UNA-USA. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Gerardo Jaramillo, Program Manager from the Unaccompanied Minors Program at Catholic Charities.
I'm Ruth Hassell-Thompson, Special Advisor presently for Governor Cuomo for Policy and Community Affairs, and I'm part of the UNA-USA Board.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Troy Wolfe. I'm Senior Director of UNA Education Programs and Learning here at the UN Foundation. I've been here for 8 years. I do a great deal of work with the UNA-USA chapters across the country, of which we have more than 150.
Good afternoon. My name is Bill Silverman. I'm a partner at Proskauer Rose LLP, and I run the pro bono program at the firm and have been very involved in immigration matters and did some work on the border.
I'm Jessica Lenz. I'm the Senior Director for Child Protection at Save the Children.
Good afternoon. I'm Sherry Murphy. I have served on the board of the United Nations Association of New York for 19 years, and I also serve on the board of ECPAT, which stands, as you may know, stands for End Child Prostitution and Trafficking, for about 5 years. Thank you.
Ginger Stillman, Jeanne Betsock Stillman, and I am Vice President for New Chapter Development, and this is the first time I have met Nadine, who is our New Chapter Development President for the Bronx. I'd like to once again welcome everybody. We're going to continue that way. Please come up.
Valerie Macon, and I'm here from Connecticut as an interested observer.
Hi, I'm Diana Thompson. I have a company that teaches 16,000 victims money in business, and I'm here to grow into New York.
Hello, my name is Joan K. Pell. I'm with the World Federation of Methodists and Uniting Women, Ecumenical Women at the UN, where I serve as the secretary, and I'm here with Dr. Brenda Smith.
Good afternoon. I am Brenda Smith, a member of the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, and I am on the board, if you will, of the UNA-USA of Westchester. And I am, the NGO representative for the World Federation of Methodists and Uniting Church Women. And good afternoon again to all of you.
Do I need a mic or can I just follow her lead?
Let's do it anyway.
Okay. So, my name is Jonathan Cummings. I'm a recent graduate of Cornell University. I just finished my MPA program in May, and I'm back in New York City. And I'm with the International Young Leaders Assembly as a diplomatic engagement associate.
We have, let's see, people out there, Wing and David come.
Oh, hi, my name is Wang Min-Jie, and I serve the board of the UN Association Southern New York Division. Very nice to meet you guys.
Come up to the microphone when you can, because it really makes a difference for the people who are on the phone.
Okay, what are you doing? Hello, my name is Wang Yin-Jie. I serve the board of the UN Association Southern New York Division. Very nice to meet you guys.
My name is Blake. I'm a college student. I've been.
Use the mic.
Sorry.
Press the button.
Sorry. My name is Blake. I've been interning for Mrs. Ginger and Mr. David. I enjoy what I do, and I'm a college student about to graduate next year.
Oh,
So,
from where?
so thank you.
From where?
I'm from Mercy College. Thank you.
Okay.
Kathy Moran, co-chairperson for the Partnership to Eradicate Human Trafficking with the Southern New York Division, UNA.
And
Good afternoon, I'm Donna Drayton, member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, one of the founding members of the Bronx chapter where I'm the vice president of advocacy. And also I am the special assistant to former Senator Ruth Hassell-Thompson.
Hello, my name is David Stillman. I'm husband of Jeanne. That gives me a lot of credibility right there. Thank you.
Okay, now, I would like to spend a little bit more time introducing our speakers. We are still missing one who's on her way here. But maybe we won't do that. Maybe we will let their words speak for themselves. And I do have a written document that I can send to you. And that way we can kind of move along. And I think that that's important. We're going to divide into small groups eventually. And then at that point, you'll all get to know each other much better in your small group. May I ask Ruth to start? We're going to start with Ruth Hassell-Thompson, Margarette Tropnas if she comes in time, and we'll go on to Gerardo, and then to Bill, and then to Troy, and Ryan and Troy. Go ahead, Ruth.
Thank you, Jean. Again, good afternoon. On April 9th, 2012, I introduced into law the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act legislation in the New York State Senate. Just a brief piece of background. You heard a couple of people refer to me as Senator Thompson. I retired from the Senate after 16 years in 2016 to become special advisor to the governor. But part of the passion that Jean spoke to was a piece of legislation. Even after leaving the Senate, I've continued to follow and make every effort to get this bill to become law. My participation in this legislation began as a result of a California criminal case involving a woman by the name of Deborah Denise Pegler, who was imprisoned for 27 years between 1983 and 2009. She was arrested on the charge of conspiracy and first-degree homicide of her husband, Oliver Wilson, a man who abused and prostituted her and sexually molested her 6-year-old child. This dramatic story began and became the subject of a documentary entitled Crime After Crime. In 1980, 3 years before the Pegler case, there was a case of Jean Struben Harris. Jean Harris was sent to prison to Bedford for killing her ex-lover, Dr. Herman Tarnow, a prominent physician from Westchester County who had abused her and aided her addiction with prescription drugs. Because Dr. Tarnow was someone known to me, I became interested in the case. I was serving as a nurse at that time for Mount Vernon Hospital, so I was familiar with his work. As I followed the case and later read the full story, I was very disturbed about the injustices that appeared so obvious to me, and felt for several reasons that Ms. Harris did not receive a fair trial. Based on several factors, she never would. This case happened long before I became an elected official, but the remnants of that injustice stayed with me, so when told about Deborah Pegler's case, I was fully engaged and truly motivated. With the help of staffers from WIPP, Jaya Wasandani, and Tamar Kraft-Stolar, and Assemblyman Jeffron Aubrey, who had initiated the language for this legislation in the New York State Assembly, I was graciously allowed to be the Senate sponsor. Through my viewing of the film, Crime After Crime, studying cases and having conversations with many women who had gone to prison for crimes stemming from felonies committed against their abusers, it became imperative that this legislation should pass. Their voices must be heard in order for them to receive justice, or they would become victimized again and again. The common thread evident in all the cases that I reviewed showed a lack of understanding or recognition of the role that physical or mental abuse played at the time the offense was committed. There was no language to define battered women. Our laws were permissive of any behavior by a spouse, toward a spouse, or domestic partner, and judges were forced by existing law to impose indeterminate sentences that were long and overly harsh, even in cases where no prior offenses had occurred. In 2016, when I left the state Senate, there were 130 women's groups and organizations around the nation that had submitted memos of support for the bill. The Senate version and then the Assembly version, which were same language. In the Senate, all three conferences, Democratic, Republican, and the IDC members, totaling 32, were co-sponsors of the bill. Since that time, there have been significant changes in the legislative seats, so I have no sense of the level of support in the legislature at this present time. The purpose of this bill was to expand upon the existing provisions of alternative sentencing for domestic violence cases, and to allow judges the opportunity to re-sentence currently incarcerated persons for offenses in which domestic violence criteria was a significant element of the offense. Domestic violence and women's incarceration are inextricably linked. 67% of women in prison for killing someone close to them were abused by that person. 9 of 10 incarcerated women have experienced severe physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. 8 of 10 have experienced severe physical or sexual violence in their childhood. 75% suffered physical violence by an intimate partner during adulthood, and 37% were raped prior to incarceration. 93% of women convicted of killing an intimate partner were abused in the past. Even though over the past 30 years, domestic violence has significantly been recognized as a national epidemic, the significant advantages by the anti-violence movement have stopped short of reforming the unjust ways in which the criminal justice system responds to and punishes domestic survivors who act to protect themselves from abusers' violence. New York State's current sentencing structure does not allow judges the discretion to fully consider the impact of domestic violence when determining sentence length, thus leading to long, unfair prison sentences for many survivors. In 2007, when the New York State Sentencing Commission was established, it reviewed the existing law and noted that it should be replaced. Just a couple of notes about the case with Deborah Pigler. The attorneys that were assigned to her were pro bono, and they were real estate lawyers who had never defended a criminal case before. Joshua Safran, Nadia Costa, and Yoav Potash were assigned for 2 years, but they continued to pursue this case for 7 years in their determination to seek justice for Mrs. Pigler. The cost of incarceration of a person in a New York State prison is approximately $43,000 per year, while the annual cost per participant of an alternative to incarceration program in New York is $11,000 a year. The Domestic Violence Survivors Act would address both issues of male and female survivors of domestic violence. Be assured that males are victims as well, though the numbers that are reported are significantly less.
Thank you very much. although she hasn't had a chance to get her breath yet. Margarette Tropnas has arrived, and Ruth has just given us the history and her personal understandings of involvement with the Domestic Violence Justice Act. Would you like to spend maybe 2 minutes? I won't give you a lot of time because she really went over. But that's okay, because you weren't here yet.
I stole for you.
Yeah, it's for the best.
I'm sorry, we had an emergency at work and.
We need to put you on speaker. Yeah.
Sorry.
So please go ahead.
Sorry for being late. We had an emergency at work. So it is very good that we are gathering here together to address serious injustice against women, children, and folks in our community. It is imperative that we bring to the attention of this nation and the world the recent proliferation of the violation of human rights. The recent separation of immigrant children from their parents and families by the greatest democracy in the world is not only blatant child abuse and long-term trauma, but it sends a message to the world to devalue children. It is important for us to promote the Domestic Violence Survivor Justice Act that is currently pending before the New York State Legislature. This is a very important in providing flexibility in the court that would prevent unjust sentencing, because it will allow judges to have autonomy in considering sentencing as it pertains to circumstances related to the abusive relationship and the connection between abuse and women sentencing to prison. Investigation shows that many abused women have a history of abuse and various trauma in their lives since early childhood. This Justice Act would allow judges to take into consideration their history of abuse and trauma when determining sentencing. We need to harness and support this bill, because when you've been traumatized and abused for many, many years, it gets to a point where women look for a way out, safety for themselves and their children. Currently, I'm working at Urban Resource Institute, which is the only facility that also allows pets in its facility. Transition, tier 2 is where we transition families into permanent home. We have 27 families with 57 children. Last year, we were able to transition about 31 families, and the year before 33. It's been very difficult this year. However, it is very hard because, domestic violence is a coercive tactic of gaining power and control over someone. It is a violation of the human spirit and sense of self. Despite federal legislation, domestic violence still remains a significant problem in our community. Immigrant women and others are further exploited while seeking help from various groups. So domestic violence destroys families, and it's important that we are here to have a better sense and understanding of what it entails, so we can advocate on behalf of these women, these voiceless women who needs our help. The Domestic Violence Survivor Justice Act is important. We provide various services at Urban Resource Institute. However, it is individuals sitting here like this who can really advocate and make that extra mile, the extra difference needed, so that women who are looking for safety, not only for themselves, for their children, and sometimes for their pets, because the children and pets are often used as a way to allow these women to remain in these abusive relationships. Children exposed to domestic violence may be influenced by messages regarding aggression, attitude and behavior, including violence and attachment disorder. So it is a serious matter in our community, and especially in the immigrant community. It's like silent, it's still a silent and taboo subject. So it is our opportunity when we are at the table, we take the information to be able to go out there and push for it. So once again, the Domestic Violence Survivor Justice Act is one way we could hold the abuser accountable, and for the women who are seeking relief for themselves to look at the full picture as opposed to looking at part of it. I know I don't have much time. We could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, we can also cover that in the small group discussion, and I hope that you will join that small group discussion, give your passion, and that you're not the only one in this room who has a real interest in this. So I think that will give an opportunity to talk. Thank you so much, Margaret. I know that it was difficult to get here. Okay, let's go on to the next topic, and that is the idea of children in storage, including in our area. Gerardo, why don't you go ahead?
Sure, thank you very much. Once again, my name is Gerardo Jaramillo. I am the program manager for the Unaccompanied Minors program at Catholic Charities. So hi everyone, and thank you for inviting me to the 5th annual consultation on race, criminal justice, and human rights. I will briefly talk about unaccompanied minors and kids who were separated from their parents. So most likely you have heard many times within the last 3 months about kids who were separated from their parents after crossing the border together. There have been many articles, news, and reports about this, and many organizations, volunteers, and attorneys have been very, very interested in helping both kids and parents. This interest has helped to have coordinated effort to address this situation. A situation that was created by the zero tolerance policy that was initially implemented and then withdrawn by the current administration. Unfortunately, there has been also a lot of misinformation about this. So I would like to briefly talk about it and maybe clarify a few things. So the category of unaccompanied minors refers to children under 18 who are apprehended by immigration authorities in the United States because they enter or present themselves to CBP, Customs and Border Patrol officers without proper authorization or documentation, and because they come unaccompanied, meaning without a legal guardian or a parent. When this happens, the Department of Homeland Security, or ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, have to transfer custody to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So basically, the Department of Homeland Security cannot take custody over unaccompanied minors or over people under 18 years old. So what they do is they have to transfer custody to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR, and in turn, place them with subcontracted facilities or shelters throughout the country. In these facilities, unaccompanied minors have access to basic services such as food, education, health, and access to legal services. In New York, Catholic Charities is the legal service provider for these children who are under the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Our team meet with them, every single one of them, in New York within 7 to 10 days after their initial placement. And I cannot provide specific numbers about the kids who are in New York, who were in New York, because of our confidentiality policies. Coming back to the kids who were separated from the parents, they are unaccompanied minors because the government made them unaccompanied when they decided to separate them from their parents. The child-parent separation issue has brought a lot of media attention, public awareness, and sometimes also unwanted attention to these children. However, the phenomenon of unaccompanied minors as a whole, kids coming to the United States seeking protection, is not new. And we, as Catholic Charities, have been working with unaccompanied minors for many years in New York. They come here fleeing violence, persecution, abuse, and many times also this abuse involves severe domestic violence in the house where they were living before. Some others come just looking for better opportunities because many times they do not have access to housing, education, or health due to historic inequality and poverty in their home countries. Many of these kids may qualify for a legal relief in the United States, so we make sure to talk to them to provide an orientation about their legal rights, but also to do a legal screening to make an assessment looking into any potential legal relief that they may qualify for. There is a process for them, in general, for all unaccompanied minors to be released and reunified with the sponsor. A sponsor here can be a family member or a family friend or a relative, even a parent, someone who had a prior relationship with the child prior to the child's arrival to the US. As I mentioned before, they are placed in shelters that have different settings. Some of them are placed with families in temporary foster care in New York, and others live in shelters like setting on campus, like CB, for example, Children's Village. There are shelters for unaccompanied minors in New York, as well as in many other states in the United States. In general, ORR, the Office of Refugee Settlement, has a child welfare mandate, which means that they are in charge of protecting and taking care of these kids until they are released and reunified with a sponsor. And I think, going back to the name of this, like a conference here, I think talking about children in storage can be a misrepresentation, and it's very similar to other terms that I have heard, such as cages for children on children's jails. Let me be clear, yes, they are technically in detention. Yes, they cannot live freely as they wish. And yes, I, and I think all of us, would like for them to be reunified as soon as possible. But it is important to also consider that they do have access to services while they are at the shelters, such as education, therapy, health, recreation, and legal services. And within its mandate, the Office of Refugee Settlement has to make sure that they can be safely reunified following the TVPRA. The TVPRA is a law that protects victims of trafficking and applies for unaccompanied minors. Coming back again to the children who were separated from parents, I think, and this is something that I share with all of you and within Catholic Charities, this was a situation that should never have occurred. Unfortunately, most of them have been reunited with their parents by now. We do have a number of these kids still in shelters in New York, but I can assure you to all that all of them have an attorney working with them either from Catholic Charities or from other pro bono legal organizations with prior experience working with children and immigrants. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end when they are able to be reunited or reunified with their parents. They still have and will have a pending case in immigration proceedings, and the government will try to remove them from the US. That's why they have to go to immigration court to fight the legal case. Numbers have shown that having an attorney greatly increases the chances for them to be able to win their legal cases and obtain legal status. And as you know, kids or people who have to go to immigration court, they do not have an attorney provided by the government. They have to obtain their own representation. And I think, I guess William Silverman is going to be able to talk a little bit more about immigration court. From our end, from Catholic Charities, we will continue working as hard as we can to advocate for the rights of unaccompanied minors, and we will make sure to speak out when it is necessary. But also, we will make sure to continue working with our partners at different levels to always ensure that these kids have access to legal information and services, and when possible, legal representation for their cases. And we will make sure that they are able to be reunified as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Bill, I think it's your turn.
Okay. I could spend a lot of time on immigration court. So I run a pro bono program. I specialize in anti-trafficking and immigration and family court. I feel like I should be working with some of you, so I'll be here. Please approach me if you think there's some pro bono support that you might think would be useful. I want to thank the UN Association for the opportunity to speak. I did spend some time at the border, and although I do pro bono work full time, and I've been doing this work, and before I was a conventional partner at a different firm, and before that I was a federal prosecutor. I've done pro bono work for many years. Nothing prepared me for what I saw at the border. And I consider it to be sort of a life-changing, certainly has radicalized me in how I view this. I think that the separation of children from families is really the tip of the iceberg, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. I think we all can agree that it's barbaric. I think it's criminal. It's child abuse sanctioned by the government, and I think it's. I don't think we need to talk. I don't need to talk about that much further. In terms of our policies, I think it's wrong that we're closing the door on refugees, and there are many policies now that are consistent with that. I think it's wrong that we're treating people, separation of families being just one example, with cruelty and without due process. And we're not respecting the rule of law. We're not respecting basic human dignity. We're running counter to the very values that our country is based upon. And I can't say this what I'm saying is just an understatement, I think. So I spent some time in Dilley, Texas, which is the country's largest immigration detention facility. These are mainly women and children, about 2,400 people. It's a 50-acre site. It is a jail. They call it a family relocation or detention center, but it's a jail. And it's very harmful to incarcerate victims of domestic violence and gang violence. And that's exactly who the people I saw were. These are women and children who are put in this facility for 2 to 3 weeks, and I'll try not to talk too long, for their credible fear interviews. When you're in expedited removal proceedings, you have a credible fear interview. If you pass your credible fear interview, you can be released, and then you can file your asylum claim. If you don't pass your interview, you have one appeal to an immigration judge, but otherwise you're essentially deported right away. So it's pretty high stakes. Everyone I met with was from one of three countries: Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. So first takeaway from my experience: the immigration crisis in this country will not change until the conditions in those three countries improve. There's nothing we can do in terms of our immigration policies that will truly stem the flow of people unless the conditions in those countries improve. So there's a lot of talk about whether we do this or whether we do that. We want to deter people from crossing the border. I'm telling you that if you actually talk to people who are taking the trip from those three countries, they are escaping some of the most severe and horrible criminal activity you'll ever hear about in your life. So takeaway number 2 is I expected to see a range. I did expect to see some people who were just crossing the border for a better life in the United States. I didn't see those people. The people I saw, the women I spoke with, were all at the extreme range. These were all people who suffered from gang violence, severe domestic violence, or both. And the domestic violence that I'm talking about is not just the domestic, just general, conventional domestic violence, and I'm not minimizing the severity of domestic violence, but what I heard, the stories that I heard, one after the other, 12 hours a day in this facility, were really the equivalent of torture, the equivalent of a form of violence and rape that I had never been aware of before. And so understanding this issue, I think also one should understand, because there's a lot of talk about how these are criminals. These people are a danger to our country. No, these people are refugees. These people are leaving a situation where they fear for their lives, they fear for their families' lives, and I think that's somehow lost in the discussion about the severity of the level of violence. There's another thing that I want to mention, because I think I'm very concerned about the changes in assignment, and there are lots of changes in the law that are occurring right now that should concern all of us. But the one change that concerns me the most is there's a decision by the Attorney General, and someone in their infinite wisdom put the immigration court in the executive branch. So it's not part of the judiciary. It's basically part of the executive branch, so that the Attorney General is sort of a one-man Supreme Court. And he issued a decision that basically said that victims of domestic violence, victims of gang violence, are generally should not be enabled to have asylum claims. And there was some reporting about this, but if he's right, or if what he says actually becomes the law, this is very dangerous. Why is it so dangerous? Why is it so important? Because everyone I spoke to in Texas were victims of domestic violence or gang violence. So if you tell me that that is no longer a basis for asylum, then thousands of people will no longer have the ability to find refuge in the United States, and thousands of people could die. And I think it's simply as serious as that. The other thing that I want to mention, and there are lots of other things I could mention about my experience, a lot of individual stories, horrible stories, is the appeal process. So while I was down there, I decided to take on some appeals. These are people, now I should also mention that the week before I got there, about 90-something% of people passed their credible fear interviews. So you might ask, why are people being housed for 2 or 3 weeks in a facility when 90% of them are then released? That seems kind of inefficient. And I think the answer to that is that the government felt, and this goes back to the Obama administration, that this would be a form of deterrent. That if you make it difficult for even for women and children once they cross the border, that fewer people will cross the border. And I'm not just making this up. If you look at New York Times articles in 2014, administration officials are saying this is a deterrent, which is really, as I said before, is problematic because people aren't going to be deterred. So what you're doing is you're just treating people poorly for no good reason. But as bad as that is, what I saw in Texas even over the course of the time I was there is a very difficult, horrible trend, which is that people started to fail their interviews. So before I got there at 90-something%, I don't know what the percent is now, but people who before were passing their interviews are now failing their interviews. To pass a credible fear interview, and I don't mean to get too far in the weeds, you need a 10% chance of winning your asylum claim. It's really meant as a low threshold just to make sure that we're not letting in people who have a frivolous asylum claim. So a 10% chance, and yet people are failing based, I think, on the administration policy and Sessions policy that asylum shouldn't apply to people victims of abuse. One final point. So I took on some appeals to the immigration court. Under the law, there is no role for lawyers during the appeal of a credible fear interview. You might say, what is that? That doesn't make any sense. So I actually appeared with children. And when it came time for me to marshal the evidence, to explain to the judge why this child shouldn't have failed his or her credible fear interview, and all the children I represented witnessed the murder of family members or other just horrible things, right? And we selected these appeals because we felt that they were very strong. So just, I said, Your Honor, may I be heard? And he said, no, you may not. Wouldn't let me talk. He wouldn't let me talk on behalf of a child, right? Because somehow an 8-year-old child is going to be able to represent him or herself. It's outrageous. And, the fact is that I've done work when I was a conventional billable lawyer in other countries, and I always thought to myself, boy, how lucky I am to be in the United States, where whatever was occurring there could never occur here. And that's just not the case. When I was a federal prosecutor, I was always very proud to say that I represented the United States. This was the first experience I've had where I was ashamed of what was going on in that so-called courtroom. And the fact that I couldn't even speak, forget about whether I win or lose, couldn't even speak, and I was sitting there and it wouldn't even have taken that much time. So I could go on, but I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. We go on to the United Nations side of things and see where we fit in with the UN. Ryan, how about you first, in talking about what we're trying to accomplish in our reporting and in bringing the American experience internationally?
Thank you so much, Ginger, and thank you to the UNA Southern New York State Division for organizing us today. Thank you to you all for being here. I'll be very brief because I'm just still catching my breath from the amazing remarks we've had and trying to wrap my head around the scope of this problem. I think it's a fair question to say, this is all very serious and we have to work together on this, but what does the United Nations have to do with it? And I think that the answer to that question is on a couple levels. First, it's this year, the UN, UNA-USA, and others are celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The idea that all of us have human rights no matter who we are, where we are, or what we're doing around the world. And this year we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of that. The second part is 4 years ago in this room, the UNA Southern New York State Division became the first UNA division to launch a consultation on the Universal Periodic Review at the UN focused on criminal justice. And the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR, is kind of a clunky acronym because it's the UN, is a tool of the United Nations that looks at the human rights records of all 193 members. Every single country has participated in this process. It has a 100% success rate, which is great. Another thing about the UPR is it applies to every human rights treaty that a country has ratified, the Universal Declaration itself, and has a very wide scope. And what I like about the UPR, what I think a lot of people around the world like about the UPR, what I think Ginger loves about the UPR, is that there's so many opportunities for civil society, for human rights defenders, for people, whether you're at your college, whether you're in a city, whether you're engaging your government on a regular basis, to participate and make an impact. And so part of that process is every 4 or 5 years, like I said, a country's human rights record is reviewed on everything from the rights of children to combating domestic violence to the right to housing to the right to food and what have you. The United States was reviewed in 2015. It got, I think, the most number of recommendations of any country. But what was great about what happened in 2015 is that that process was really impacted by inputs from people in the United States across the country on a variety of topics, including a report from UNA-USA that looked at LGBTI human rights, criminal justice and criminal justice reform, human rights treaties, and the human rights of girls and women. And right now we're in the part of the process of the UPR that is the midpoint review. And this is a process that I think has been a little unsung as an opportunity to continue to engage on the Universal Periodic Review, to continue to submit inputs and say, you got this recommendation to improve your human rights record on the rights of children. Are you doing it? You got a recommendation to combat domestic abuse and domestic violence. Are you doing that right now? And so we're right in the thick of that midterm reporting process, and that's part of the very unique consultation we're having today, which Ginger will talk more about after the speaking program. I guess it's fair to ask too, does the Universal Periodic Review matter? Is this just a UN mechanism that's there, that sounds very nice, but doesn't really impact anything? Well, the main NGO that tracks the UPR, that looks at engagement, has found that about 48% of recommendations that countries accept trigger some sort of action, either full implementation or some kind of partial implementation. So that's good news. Another part of it is when we submit these reports, when we tell the UN Human Rights Council what's going on, it goes on the Human Rights Office website. So anyone from around the world, including the United States, can see what's happening, what people are saying in that country, as well as what best practices are recommended. And because of the way the UPR works, based on those reports, recommendations are made to that country under review. And I think the neat thing we saw as UNA-USA the last time we went around in this process was that some of the recommendations we made appeared to the US and the US accepted at the Human Rights Council, related to combating human trafficking, related to human rights treaties, related to LGBTI issues. That was really exciting to see the recommendations we talk about in this room appearing at the Human Rights Council and having the US accept those recommendations, which is important. Now, it's no secret that the US has pulled out of the Human Rights Council. We think that was not a great decision, and it's best to engage on human rights and to have a seat at the table. But I think when you have grassroots human rights activists, when you have people who have been impacted by these issues, people who have the experience, like we've just heard, coming and talking about these issues, sharing best practices, that's going to force the United States and others to engage on this issue, and it's really important to continue to have these dialogues. So just to close, I think this conversation is about getting best practices and getting some of the challenges we've heard about on the record. It's an opportunity to continue to channel our concern, our shock, and frankly, a lot of outrage into practical action that can advance human rights on a mechanism that is there for civil society to use. And we also heard about U.S. values, which I think is a very important thing that we can't overlook, but also continue to look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as not just an abstract document about principles that doesn't have any real-world implications, but as a practical tool to make sure that everyone around the world is free and equal and their human rights are respected, whether it relates to domestic abuse or the rights of children that we're talking about today. So thank you very much. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. I'd like to go on to Troy next, who is the Senior Director for Education and many other things. And one of the reasons Troy and I started talking about this was because we are hoping that chapters and divisions around the country of UNA-USA start taking on the issue of race, criminal justice, and human rights. And it was with that optique that we started saying, let's do something this summer, and here's our chance. Please.
Thank you, Ginger, and thanks to the Southern New York State Division for coordinating this meeting. I think this is my third consultation on race, being part of it, and I have evolved in my own knowledge and thinking around these issues. My heart is heavy as we come together with this. I have done a little bit of research, and I thank the expertise, and I'm happy that I'm last because a lot of things I was going to touch on, the panel has already touched on. And for people who are not familiar with subject matter, I think it gives you a great foundation from which to have further conversations on. I am prepared to talk a little bit today about the impact of children in storage and what UNA-USA possible ideas and strategies we can do. But I also find it necessary to give this entire conversation a broader context. And the broader context is about race and the evidence of hate that's going on in the United States. And I think it's a misnomer and a disservice to kind of talk about these issues without talking about some of the evidence that is out there, which leads us to some of these uncomfortable conclusions. But before I get into that, Ryan mentioned the UPR and how what we do here can inform what goes on at the UN. Last month, there was a high-level political forum, which is a gathering of many nations and coming together to look at successes and achievements that we're making towards achieving Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development Goals. And they use a mechanism called the VNR, which is the Voluntary National Review. Many of you in the room know that New York City is the first city in the world to do a voluntary local review, which is looking at and assessing our progress towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And I think we have like 4,551 days left in order to achieve these. The readout in that report comes that we are not where we need to be in order to reach these targets, and so we should all be alarmed by that. And the Secretary General closed the high-level political forum with some statements. He gave 5 suggestions on ways that we can meet there. 4 of them are not really relevant in the context of why we're here meeting today, but one was. And one of the things that the Secretary General said was that we could come together and engage young people more. And so in providing a broader context about some race things that are going on and possibly what we can do as a grassroots movement of advocates who support the goals and ideas of the United Nations, specifically as it relates to the Sustainable Development Goals, I just want to share with you 4 quick little bullets, just so that as we move into the breakout groups, we can also put this thinking around the conversations that we're going to have. One of the things that we can do is to commit to UNA-USA chapters on a college campus near you, if in fact one does not exist. Or we can support chapters. I think there's someone on the phone from Michigan or another state. We can support chapters in other areas with creating college campus-based chapters. Why? There's a statistic that I came across on the web, and it says since September 1st, 2016, the Anti-Defamation League has recorded 478 incidents of white supremacist propaganda appearing on college campuses and university campuses. These campaigns have targeted 287 college campuses in 47 states and the District of Columbia. We need to do something about that. We can develop, as Ginger said, consultation on race toolkits so that other chapters, we have more than 150 chapters across the United States, it would be great to replicate what this forum is, what this forum does, and like we do this locally to inform the UPR, do this nationally so that we can collect data and really move the indicator over at the United Nations. We can increase the presence of Model UN mini simulations. Any Model UNers in the room? No? Okay, so Model UN is a simulation of the UN where students role play as ambassadors and seek resolutions to the world's most pressing problems. UNA-USA, with funding from the State Department back in 2012, we created something called a mini simulation. A mini simulation is an activity that anyone who knows nothing about the UN, is not a teacher, knows nothing about the subject matter, can engage a small group or a large group in a conversation about some global issues, and you walk away better informed. It is a great way to create peace and raise understanding. Why is that important in the middle schools and high schools? In our very own New York, upstate, the Ku Klux Klan is recruiting middle school and high school students. They are leaving paraphernalia and propaganda out at the end of driveways with a Snickers bar or a candy bar attached to it, and they are encouraging young people to get involved in these conversations about hate. We can use and monitor messages on social media. You know, I've been asking myself, how can we begin to use social media better for the better good of the order? There's a great deal of fake news out there, and in my opinion, fake news these days seems to be winning out over real news. And so we have a very significant crisis. And earlier today I was speaking to one of my colleagues in the office and just trying to get, you know, what information is out there that really is speaking to how social media is being used for good to really inform people of what the truth is. And the best scenario that we came up with Facebook right now, I don't know if everybody's aware of what happened with Mark Zuckerberg on Capitol Hill, but Facebook is really, you might want to Google it, as Facebook's plan to police the truth. This is an initiative that they are really starting, at least as it relates to that social media vehicle, where they're looking at what is being posted on there, and they don't want to be responsible for pushing and marketing hate. There are certainly other things that we can do. I think we're in the forefront really of understanding the power of social media and how we can use it for good, and so it's a conversation that we certainly need to be mindful of. Lastly, I look forward to breaking out in the groups and hearing some suggestions that you have that we can certainly share with the 150 chapters across the country, and better ways that we can engage young people. Thank you.
Thank you, Troy. Our next step is going to be to divide into small groups. And we have 3 groups planned for the Children in Storage concept, and one for the Domestic Violence Justice Act concept. First of all, could I have a show of hands of those who are most interested in joining the group on the Domestic Violence Justice Act? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. I think what we'll do is put that group over in the small conference room across the way. And where is Donna? I'm over here. Okay. Donna will be the facilitator, and Nadine, who is down there, is going to be the rapporteur. So, do you each have the directions for small group instructions? Yeah. You should, okay. And then if you need more copies of the back side, you can either continue on plain paper or ask us and we can photocopy this, or you can take some for somebody else. We want to collect these at the end of the day, and there are 2 ways of doing it. One is that if you're somebody who's doing it on a computer, fine, just email it to us. If you're somebody who's doing it in handwriting, what we want to do first is get a photocopy of it at the end of the day today, and then you can write up your notes into something pretty and send it in. But if I want something in hand, okay? For the next, we had 3 groups, and I think this sounds about right for the number of people we have here. One who's dealing with the asylum kids in New York State, and that may, we may not have as many as we had, but it's been an issue. And we have some documented information on that, and perhaps Gerardo has some information on the New York State aspect of it. We also have a number of resources that have been printed that you have access to as a small group if you would like to have more information. For example, I know that we have a New York Times piece about the Cayuga centers, and that would be available to you. We also have a piece on how many places in New York State, or at least in the southern tier where the division is, where kids were sent. And I don't know how many are there now because, as Gerardo said, there's a confidentiality process that goes on that means it's really hard to get real information. It's the way it is. I know that my daughter-in-law was going to accompany, who is an attorney and originally from Colombia, was going to accompany a group of Latin American consuls to go to one of the sites. And I think that 3 times now it's been postponed by the site. So that's where we are. Okay, so think of it, do you want to be in that group? Or do you want to be in the group that deals with the asylum policies and processes at the southern border? And obviously Bill knows a great deal about that, and I assume Gerardo does too. But I would ask you to join that group if you would, Bill. But there's also the group on what can we do, and that relates to what are we going to report to the UN, what are our strongest policies that we want to promote. And I hope that Ryan will spend some time there. And Ryan is also going to float, and I think Troy will also, to join any group. And I hope our speakers will do that. Margaret, I hope that you will certainly spend your time with the domestic violence group. However, I know that you're very interested in immigrant issues generally, and those are some of the people with whom you work directly.
Could we combine groups 2 and 3?
We could do that. That's another thing that we could do. Okay. In that case, what we're going to do is, should we put the group 1 into the 905 conference room?
Sure. How many?
How many want to be in the group
7
1?
or 8?
Not the domestic violence Justice Act, but the group 1 having to do with asylum kids.
Asylum kids, how many?
1,
2,
3,
4. Great. I'll get 5 chairs.
Okay. And so Troy will set it up for you. And then I think that we need, George is going to be, no.
Troy and David are both in play here.
Oh, okay. So, George, could you work with that group, please?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Uh-huh. That would probably work well, because you know this area. And the remaining, the others will stay in this room.